It's another Marvel Monday, and today I'm going to be returning to the X-Men animated series retro line from Hasbro. And today's pick, of course, is Mr. Sinister. Now, this is fairly significant because we haven't had many villains from the series so far. To date, we've only had Mystique and Apocalypse in this retro line. So, Mr. Sinister is a very welcome addition, especially because he is such a significant character in the animated series. But, as the saying goes, all that glitters is not gold, and I definitely have a few issues with some of the peripheral elements of this release. And we'll get into all of that as the video progresses, but let's start off by looking at the packaging. Now, by now, if you've seen any of my other videos in this series, you'll know I'm actually a huge fan of this VHS approach. Obviously, this is a clever workaround for the plastic-free approach that Hasbro have recently adopted in the line, but here I think it works really well because I used to collect these VHSs when I was a child, and I think they're very, very evocative and very nostalgic. I really love this artwork as well. I think it's done a really nice job of capturing the essence, the spirit, the atmosphere of this character. I think it's really colourful and really fun, and as I said, very atmospheric. So I think this is really, really nice. It looks great on display. And if we look at the side panel, we can see that this is a pretty chunky box this time around. This is almost twice the width of the usual releases in this series. So this is nice and chunky. Again, it's pretty consistent with the other figures we've seen in the line. So if we put them next to another release, we can see they start to stack up very, very nicely. But you can definitely see how thick this packaging is in comparison to the others. The other cool thing about this packaging is that if you flip it around, you can actually have the two heads sort of facing off against each other as well. So you could have all your villains stacked one way and all your heroes stacked the other. It's just an aesthetic thing, but I quite enjoy that. And then if we look at the reverse of the packaging again, an awful lot of this is given over to small print, unfortunately, certainly the bottom third of the packaging. But hey, at the top of the packaging we do have an image there of the figure, and I think this is a digital rendering, which I'm not a huge fan of, but it still looks pretty attractive. We have a bit of bio on the left there. It's okay, it's not the most attractive thing. You're not going to want to really display this side of the packaging, but it does its job. To their credit, the card for this packaging is pretty thick and hefty, which I quite like, so it's nice and strong and stable. Obviously, it is plastic free, so we do have this sort of card interior that you can kind of unwrap the figure, and of course the figure itself is contained in this rice paper. I should also point out that this isn't the first time we've had Mr. Sinister in the Marvel Legends line. We've had two previous releases, one from Toy Biz and one from Hasbro. The most recent Hasbro release was from the Wendigo wave, and it's going to be an important point of comparison in this video because it will become quite clear that this is essentially just a repaint of that previous release. And that's not unusual for this line, but they usually give you something unique, bespoke to each release. But not this time, it would appear. If we take a look at this head sculpt, it is exactly the same as the previous release. They haven't made any run-in changes to the sculpt. They haven't even changed the expression on the face. The key difference here is the paint apps, of course. So now we have this eyeshadow that arcs upwards, which looks really cool. I have to say this is very effective and I really like this approach. This, of course, replaces the eyebrows on the original release, and that's basically it. The only other key difference is, of course, he has now a little bit of white on the neck, rather than having that sort of buttoned-up approach that they took on the original release, and he now has a little bit of blue, which is the cell shading on the top of his widow's peak there. Of course, behind him, we have his sort of big collar there. Again, they've applied the cell shading, and we'll notice that generally overall in this figure, he has a much brighter blue and some more of that shadowing, that cell shading across the figure. But otherwise, this is exactly the same. Okay, so how does it compare to its animated counterparts on screen? Well, I think they've done a pretty decent job, actually. I think this sculpt works perfectly well for this character, and the paint apps and the cell shading seem to have worked a treat, so I think they've done a really nice job of replicating what we see on screen. But there are a few subtle things that aren't quite accurate, and the key one here is the belt. As you can see in the animated series, he wears this white belt here, but on the figure, it's red. This is a very minor thing, of course, but nevertheless, for purists, this might be a little bit irritating. But other than that, this is a very nice body sculpt. I really like this figure first time around, so I haven't really got any complaints. And if anything, they have improved it slightly. I like the brighter colours personally. I'm also a fan of the cell shading approach. I really like capturing the animated series feel. So for me, this works a real treat and is a slight enhancement on what we already have. But I do have to be critical, thinking there's nothing else really new here, and I feel like they've missed an opportunity to do something. Particularly if we look at the hands. They're exactly the same hands hands as we got in the original release, why couldn't we have got some alternate hands, two pairs of closed fists, two pairs of open hands, maybe some blast effects or something like that? That would have made this a little bit more enticing for those who'd already picked up the initial release. As it is, it's much harder to justify the double dip when the only real change here is the brightness of the paint. Articulation wise, he does have a ball joint in his neck there, so of course he can move his head from side to side. It is going to be limited by that huge collar though, so that's something to bear in mind. He can lift his head up and down, and again, there are restrictions here, so you have to be careful working with that collar, but there's still plenty of movement. He does have ball joints in his shoulders, so he can lift his arms all the way up and out there, which is really good. Of course, there's a complementary bicep swivel, double joints in the elbows there, though it's a little bit tricky to get that bottom one to work because the bicep's so large. Then he has a pin swivel at the wrist, so that wrist will rotate all the way around, then it'll hinge forwards and backwards. Then straight swivel at the waist, so of course he will move from side to side, and he has that ab crunch as well, which allows him to bend forwards and backwards, and this moves a pretty healthy range. There's more ball joints in the hips, the legs will kick out to the side. There is a thigh swivel at the very top there, the top of the boot, which is quite subtle, and I like that, I think that works well. And there's another swivel at the bottom of the ankle there as well, which is a nice touch, so I think that works pretty well. The legs kick forwards, they kick backwards, there's a double joint at the knee, so that lower leg will kick all the way back as well, and then we have the ankle rockers at the very bottom on that ball joint, so of course they'll hinge forwards, backwards, and move from side to side. There are absolutely no accessories with this figure, which I do think is important to point out. So let's have a quick comparison between these two figures. Let's stand them side by side, and as you can see, it's the same figure. There's just some very gentle cosmetic changes. The bands on the top of the wrists there, of course, obviously have been changed to a brighter red this time around. Obviously the paint apps overall, less of a metallic sheen on the body, and of course it's more of a consistent dark blue, and then we have the cell shading. And that's about it. And for a quick scale comparison, here he is standing next to Wolverine from the same series. So these scale very nicely. Mr. Sinister is a little bit taller than your average 6-inch figure. He's probably verging on 7 inches, so a little bit taller. Obviously Wolverine's a little bit smaller, so there's actually a quite noticeable height difference between these two characters. But they look great, and I really do love this brighter animated series approach. So I think these look fantastic together and make for a pretty nice set. So, final thoughts. Well, I'm going to have to be a little bit harsher on this release. I'm only going to actually give him 2 stars. And that's probably unfair because there's nothing actually wrong with this figure on its own merits. The figure itself is good, the articulation is nice, the paint apps are well applied, I do really like the cell shading, the articulation works really well. Everything about the figure itself is absolutely fine. So if you don't have Mr. Sinister already, or this previous release from the Wendigo series, then he's definitely worth picking up, and I think you'll really like having him in your collection. But if you already picked him up, then this is much harder to justify. I love the animated series and I do really like the cell shading, so for me that is something that is tempting, but I have to be honest, he's priced at twice the price of the usual figures in this subline, which I don't understand. You're getting so much less with this figure. We don't have any accessories, there's nothing really bespoke or particularly unique about this version of the figure other than the paint apps, and I find that really hard to get my head around and to justify. So I had to wait. He did drop in price, and then it was at a price point at which I was comfortable double dipping, but for most collectors I would imagine this would be a little bit of a turn off if you've already picked up the original release, and for that reason alone I've got to take some stars off this, because I just feel as a release it feels very cheeky really on Hasbro's part, and I don't know why they didn't just put some simple green plastic pieces for the effects that they usually give these characters. They could have at least given him that, at least given him some swappable hands, something. For me personally, I would have liked a different expression on the head, or a couple of choices of heads. Alternate heads would have been fantastic, but as it is, it really feels like they've gone bare bones with this and just made some running changes to the paint apps and the plastic, and that's very disappointing. If you enjoyed this video, please do give it a like, and remember to subscribe as there'll be plenty more videos soon.